Hello, good evening, or good afternoon, possibly even good morning, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome to the October edition of Lacan in Scotland. Um, it's an enormous delight to welcome Clint Burnham to join us this evening. Um, Clint is Professor of English at Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, and I've just discovered um, this evening that he is also a poet and a novelist as well as an academic, which I had no idea, despite having met Clint before. But in our particular environment, he is a Lacanian scholar and, amongst other things, is the editor of this fantastic volume, which, in addition to being a fantastic read, is one of the few books in the Paul Grave Lacan series that managed to sneak a color other than green onto the cover. So, congratulations for that too. Um, but without further ado, Clint, I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Thank you. I can't remember what the title was that circulated, but I think it just cut it in half, and it's now just called Mari Ruti and Climate Grief. I'd like to thank Calum Neill and Amanda and the Lacan in Scotland for the opportunity to speak, and also to Sheldon George, Anna Kornblue, Hilary Neroni, Rosemary Overall, and Francis Rusticcia for the conversations that have helped me develop this paper. This talk is part of a larger project in thinking in a psychoanalytic way about climate politics that goes back, at least in my work, to an intervention at the Petrocultures Conference in Edmonton, Canada in 2012, when I was talking about Edward Burtynsky's photographs of tailing ponds and pipelines and the tar sands project in Fort McMurray. There, I criticized the conception of the arboreal forest where the tar sands located as some pure or unsullied nature, the lack in the big other that we mistake for a lost object. More recently, the Vancouver Lacan Salon organized a conference on Lacan and the environment in 2018, which was followed by a collection of essays of the same title, edited by Paul Kingsbury and me, and published in 2021 by Paul Grave in the Paul Grave Lacan series that Calum and Derek Hook co-edit. The conference and the book collected some important work by Cindy Zyher, Todd McGowan, Nathan Gorelick, Hilda Fernandez, among others. In our introduction, Kingsbury and I discussed the famous Lacan anecdote in Seminar 7 of the sardine can floating in the ocean as a figure of nature, but also pollution as the barred subject. We were also interested in the subjectivity of the climate denialist, in part because of how Kingsbury has worked on proximate figures in the paranormal, like UFO enthusiasts and Bigfoot hunters, those who similarly mistrust science, but also seem to want to be scientists. Or as another similar figure will say, the anti-vaxxer will say, do your own research. This past spring and summer, a number of events shaped my work in a more immediate, not to say contingent fashion. First, shortly after she spoke at the LAC conference in Burlington, Vermont, the psychoanalytic theorist Mari Ruti died of breast cancer. This was a blow for many of us, and already my chronology is mixed up because between seeing Mari at LAC in mid-April and hearing of her death 2 months later, I spoke at a conference in Vancouver called Facing Ecological Grief. Summer 2023 was already turning out to be the worst summer in Canadian history for forest fires, incinerating more than 15 million hectares across the country, shattering the previous record of 7.6 million hectares in 1989, as well as the 10-year average of 2.5 million hectares. Smoke enveloping the east coast of the US and floating over to Europe, towns evacuated, firefighters recruited from Australia and South Africa and France, firefighters killed. Where I live in the city of Vancouver on Canada's west coast, on, as we say, the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including those of the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Coquitlam. The smoke is sometimes present, indeed was in the past month. There's something about waking up in the middle of the night and smelling smoke, breathing it in, to bring on all kinds of affect. Finally, 2 months ago, my own father died, which, while it happened suddenly, he had had dementia for the previous 2 years. In some ways, he was already not there, between two deaths, as we say in the jargon, or I had pre-grieved, as they say on the TV show Succession. Which brings me to today's talk, which draws on papers I recently delivered at the University of Otago in New Zealand and at the Mahindra Seminar at Harvard University. First on the jouissance of the climate activist, taking as my cultural object a podcast in which Canadian anti-logging protesters returned to the site of their activism 2 years later. And then on the first part of my talk, my title today, How to Sublimate the Thing from Inner Space, turning to Richard Powers' 2018 novel, The Overstory. That protest, the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history, with over 2,000 protesters arrested, and we should think about what kind of sublime numbers, sublime objects, these largest forest fires, largest protests constitute. That protest was quite similar to the tree-sitting protests that form the activist core of Powers' novel. Later in my talk today or this evening, I will turn to two other cli-fi or climate fiction novels, Jenny Fagan's The Sunlight Pilgrims and Mandy Suzanne Wong's The Box, as the cultural objects for critique, culminating in a reading of the Coincidentia Oppositorum of climate denialism and climate grief, via Freud's kettle logic and Kubler-Ross's stages of grieving. But first, I bring Mari Ruti's theories of sublimation, creativity, and our relation to the thing as modalities of working through climate grief. My findings then are, first of all, that climate denialism constitutes a universal subjectivity. We all, in various ways, reject or repress or deny or disavow our role and or climate science qua university discourse. But the cunning ruse of reason, that dialectic, makes it all right, for by refusing the ontologization of lack, that is, by not ceding our desire, we can, as climate denialists, become true ethical or revolutionary subjects. Let's see how we get there. My talk thinks with Mari Ruti's late works, two essays, When the Cure is That There Is No Cure and The Brokenness of Being. The first is soon to be published in a collection from Routledge called Meaningless Suffering, Traumatic Marginalization and Ethical Responsibility. The second is forthcoming in the journal Angolaki with a commentary by Hilary Neroni. I draw on them better to understand what is now called climate grief. Ruti talked from those two texts in lectures she gave at the Psychology and the Other conference in Boston in the fall of 2021 and at the LAC conference this past April, less than 2 months before her death from cancer on June 8, 2023. Talks that both draw on a remarkable body of work, but also mark a return to auto theory or a turn to auto theory as she grapples with her own diagnosis. I want to make two brief comments. One, a potted overview of Ruti's oeuvre. The other, the discussion of the vexed problem of auto theory, particularly as it is circumscribed for us in Anna Kornbluh's forthcoming book, Immediacy. Mari Ruti's work spans 2 decades of books, talks, essays, and interventions, and includes, from my POV, 3 remarkable texts: Distillations, Theory, Ethics, Affect, from 2018, The Ethics of Opting Out, Queer Theory's Defiant Subjects, from 2017, and The Singularity of Being, Lacan and the Mortal Within, from 2012. And I know I am leaving out some important texts, some of your favorite texts, no doubt, if you know Mari's work, including Constellations, The Case for Falling in Love, The Call of Character, Penis Envy, her biography of Julia Kristeva written with Alice Jardine, her book on Lacan and Melanie Klein written with Amy Allen. But it was in Distillations, Singularity, and Opting Out that she staked out a reading of Lacan that is not only amenable to so-called affect theory and queer theory, but more importantly, in my view, one that diverges from a certain tendency in post-Lacanian theory, the Slovenian school and its American followers, the tendency to privilege the real as some horrifying and traumatic encounter. Quote, to privilege the destructiveness of the drive over the lures of desire. That's Ruti from her No Cure essay. In Distillations, for example, Ruti points out the tendency of the new universalism found not only in Zizek and Badiou, but also such North American academics as Todd McGowan, Paul Eisenstein, Zahi Jalua, and Ilan Kapoor. That quote, she says, does not adequately distinguish between various identitarian movements, precisely in the sense that they take it for granted that every singularity, the universalists that is, take it for granted that every singularity can claim an immediate membership in the universal. Nonetheless, Ruti is also able, to make the implausible connection between the Lacanian universalists and affect theory, as when she argues that Sarah Ahmed's feminist killjoy evinces the kind of rupture for which Eisenstein and McGowan advocate, or Badiou's possibility of the impossible. I should stress that for me, I am sympathetic to Ruti's critique as well as the absolute negativity of her opponents. The stakes are perhaps evident in Lee Edelman's rejoinder, however. Mari Ruti, he tells us, this is in Bad Education, repurposes liberal humanism, vaunting social survival, justice, and responsibility without recognizing that the split in the subject, the fracture at the core of post-humanist thought, makes those three things incompatible. I may be unfair in characterizing Ruti and her opponents in this way, or even indeed calling them opponents. It's worth noting that she had exceedingly cordial relations with many of the figures I just mentioned. 2, Anna Kornblue goes out of her way to cite Ruti in her new book, which cannot honestly be said to be describing Ruti's project in its characterization of auto theory, even if generically that is the self-described trajectory of Ruti's late work. I'll come back to Kornblue's critique later. To sit with when the cure is that there is no cure and the brokenness of being. What is important about the two texts is how they treat what Ruti refers to as the idiosyncratic or contingent lack that is a bout with cancer, or other forms of benchmark trauma that appear as if out of nowhere, in comparison with ontological or constitutive lack, that is the psychoanalytic incurability of human existence, as well as the systemic or structural lack that is due to socio-political conditions, the injuries of racism, classism, cis-heteropatriarchy, and or colonialism. That is, she's dealing here with what we might see as the clusterfuck I have proposed as a way of thinking about climate change alongside anti-Black violence and COVID-19, or an overlapping overlap of lacks, and how they stack up against one another. Lee Edelman has proposed a resistance to assigning questions of urgency, to hierarchizing priority in dealing with the same issues, arguing that they are rather, quote, ongoing aspects of human political experience, inevitable outcomes of the cleavage in the subject's relation to jouissance, although he does seem to make an exception for climate change. But this question of an overlap of grief or trauma, of its fungibility, is also one that we will see turns up in our novelistic examples. For the social novel today rarely treats the climate crisis separable from other forms of trauma or grief, even as, so argued by Amitav Ghosh, it is on the one hand incapable of responding to said trauma, and yet implicated in causing it. Ruti's observation is that, in part for her, when she received her diagnosis in 2018, and was told she had 12 to 18 months life expectancy, so she beat those odds, she was better able to receive that bad news because she already had a Lacanian diagnosis baked into her psyche. So she is positing not an ontologization of grief, as is frequent in the normative accounts found in Renee Lertzman, Sally Weintraub, or Donna Orange, the best-known psychological authorities on climate grief, but instead a dialectics thereof. Ruti's writing here is important, I believe, for its contradictions. One of these, for instance, lies at the heart of her "The Cure When There Is No Cure" thesis. Let me restate the argument as follows, Ruti tells us. If we were not fundamentally lacking, we would not have the creative, innovative capacity to endure the kinds of more contingent lacks, crisis situations, everyday disasters, that most of us from time to time are destined to experience. If we had no familiarity, however unconscious, with what it feels like to be lacking, we truly would not know how to react when something went terribly wrong in our lives. We would not know how to even begin to formulate a response to the calamity at hand. I have chosen Lacan, Klein, and Kristeva as my main interlocutors, she tells us, because all three grasp this reality. They share an understanding of the very relationship between constitutive lack, creativity, and our always fragile ability to handle contingent traumas that I wish to explore. So that's from No Cure. She phrases the question somewhat differently, but with the same result, I think, in The Brokenness of Being. Quote, my sense is that those who have gathered an awareness of the incurable nature of their ontological lack have often also developed an array of psychic and affective strategies for coping with benchmark traumas. Strategies that may not be available to those who have avoided their lack or have sought to fix it with easy solutions such as rampant consumerism. I don't know if I agree. It seems to me that contingent lacks or benchmark traumas also have more force, indeed only have any force because of constitutive lack. To reverse the Ruti thesis here is to posit the coincidence of opposites. That is, it is the very coinciding of ontological lack and that which happens once in a lifetime or in an unprecedented way, the benchmark traumas of cancer or anthropogenic climate change, that makes the latter so brutal. Or perhaps the reason we think of such lacks, correctly labeled by Ruti as contingent or idiosyncratic, is that their psychic effects can be, well, contingent. Some of us laugh it off. Some of us descend into a trough of depression and melancholia. Some of us dwell on it for years, and some of us veer back and forth between denial and embrace. The two words contingent, used 3 times in the Cure essay, and idiosyncratic, used more often, almost 24 times, are telling. Contingent is rare in occurrence in Ruti's text, I think, because it is closer, connotatively speaking, to the socioeconomic, to precarious employment. We speak of contingent faculty in the academy. As we will see, Anna Kornblue suggests that this economic factor plays a role in the development of autofiction and auto theory. And yet it also suggests a randomness, the aleatory quality. And here we can think of the clinical nostrum that an analysand's presenting symptom is rarely that which marks their lack. If a patient comes in and says they are troubled by forest fires or rising sea levels, that this gives them anxiety, then the job of the clinic is to move past those utterances, the sujet dénoncé or the enunciating subject, and follow the network of signifiers to the fundamental fantasy, the cleavage in the jouissance, the sujet d'énonciation or the subject of the statement, the unconscious. Indeed, when the subject declares that their mother died of cancer 2 years ago and now a logged forest's devastation brings it all back, or if I find myself unable to grieve because of my father's recent death, because my grief stack is already full up with worrying about this past summer's forest fires, about breathing that smoke, the fungibility of this trauma or grief, its contingency, to return to Ruti's keyword, should also give us pause. Then, idiosyncratic seems more individual, personal, the singularity that is a hallmark of Ruti's thinking. Etymologically, the word idiosyncratic carries the suggestion of blaming the victim, attributable to individual disposition, susceptibility, or character. That's the OED. But also owing, as with idiom or idiot, to the ancient Greek root idios, meaning a private or lay, but also uneducated person. I confess that I do like the idiotic connotations of idiosyncratic. Surely I was an idiot to go camping in the wilderness during Canada's worst forest fire season in history. I want to look at this contradiction in more depth and also other contradictions that I think are operative in Ruti's essays as a memorial working through of my grief, which is to say my grief with Ruti's death this past summer, which seems to have accumulated or weaponized on the one hand, climate grief when faced with a summer of forest fires, and also a contingent or idiosyncratic grief of encountering my father's death in August. It goes without saying, which is why I'm saying it, that I'm talking about the contradictions not as a way of pointing out inadequacies in the text, which would be a real dick move, since it is by necessity a posthumous work, but because the most important texts have contradictions at their heart. Mari Ruti's essays' full titles are, first, When the Cure is That There Is No Cure, Melancholia, Mourning, Creativity, and The Brokenness of Being, Lacanian Theory and Benchmark Traumas. So with the first, we have a direct Freudian reference, his Mourning and Melancholia paper, and a signal to what will be the most important avenue when there is not a cure, creativity. Creativity is what we turn to as a cure for there being no cure, as a way to accept. Ruti draws on Jacques Lacan, Julia Kristeva, and Melanie Klein, she tells us, in order to see that, quote, creativity, potentially at least, offers an antidote to melancholia as an ontological or existential predicament. Moreover, creativity can serve as a productive, albeit always incomplete and imperfect, response to both ontological lack and benchmark trauma. And mourning for Kristeva and Freud, or melancholia for Lacan and Klein, are themselves stepping stones to that creativity. Such creativity, Ruti asserts here, does not or should not be offered as a cure for systemic trauma. since such inequities can presumably be, quote, be fixed by more just and egalitarian social arrangements. She returns to the question of systemic or structural trauma late in the No Cure essay. Ruti hedges her bet. She recognizes that, quote, collective remedies to structural injustices are unlikely to materialize anytime soon, and that many dispossessed individuals are therefore left to their own devices in trying to find ways to cope with their predicament. Later, she expands on the role of creativity in such conditions by way of the negative. Creativity, she tells us, should not be seen as an alternative to political and practical efforts, but merely as a supplement to such efforts, as a temporary placeholder for the sturdier remedies and solutions we hope to achieve. However, denying the potential of creative activities, which could be as simple as painting a rundown apartment or setting up a community garden in a poor neighborhood, to provide solace on grounds of ideological purity, would be a mistake, for the simple reason that whatever can be done to diminish people's suffering in the here and now is valuable and does not, in principle, need to interfere with our pursuit of long-term solutions. Such material aesthetic actions marry the creative and the ameliorative and bear some family resemblance to the Black Panthers', quote, reform without reformism, or survival pending the revolution, as the history of the party is titled. Or to be more precise, the supplementary placeholder function suggests a secondary role. But I think Ruti's concept of creativity is more than simply a sublimation of the proper political action or agency into the aesthetic, which would be a model of sublimation more Freudian than Lacanian, after all. Since for Lacan, sublimation is not so much a diversion of the libidinal into the aesthetic, as per Freud, and of course, Freud sees political action itself as a form of sublimation, indeed one necessary for human civilization. Lacanian sublimation is not that diversion, but rather, as he famously put it in Seminar 7, the seminar on the ethics of psychoanalysis, what he called the raising of an object to the dignity of the thing. In Brokenness, Ruti develops this idea in more depth, arguing that the thing is both a sublime object that destroys us and a fantasy-infused placeholder for everything that we imagine having lost. Here is Scott Critch on how Ruti conceptualizes sublimation, and pay attention to a certain Ruti keyword. Ruti proposes, Critch tells us, after Lacan, that only certain unpredictable objects will provide for a subject the kind of auratic experience essential to the thing. As Ruti sees it, sublimation enacts a commitment to one's idiosyncratic, but also singularly consistent attitude to desire. Sublimation, then, is, quote, and this is Critch quoting Ruti, a matter of struggling to find ways to incorporate the echo of the thing as the cause of our idiosyncratic desire into the rhythm of our social lives, even when doing so proves demanding. So I should like to, this is me now, I should like to remark on Ruti's consistency. She remains faithful to this notion of idiosyncratic desire. That quote was from her 2009 volume, A World of Fragile Things, in her recent essay, Brokenness of Being, quote, the sublimatory gesture of raising an ordinary object into an extraordinary state allows us to draw closer to the truth of our desire, the kind of desire that is governed by our jouissance rather than by the desire of the big other, the dominant sociocultural and linguistic establishment. Idiosyncratic desire, idiosyncratic lack. We might discuss Ruti's incurable contradictions in 4 sites or nodes of sublimation, 1 conceptual, that of creativity, and 3 having to do with objects that also, in her two texts, function as topoi or figures, the beach and the ocean, the ring, and Cézanne's, but also iPhone's Apple. I'll talk about one of these figures, the ring. Ruti tells us that objects that contain a strong aura of the thing can connect us towards jouissance, that some objects have the power to lessen the sting of our ontological lack and of the melancholia that haunts so many of us due to this lack, even as she is, quote, not looking to heal her wounds or to obtain ontological wholeness. So this is Ruti from No Cure. During a recent trip to a small town in the south of France, I bought 2 silver rings, meant to be worn together, one with a little white pearl and the second with 7 narrow bands bunched together to create a wider band. I do not usually wear rings and rarely buy items during trips, but those rings somehow leapt at me from the display case. The psychoanalyst Marian Milner notes how finding an elegant dress once made her feel recentered and re-empowered after a vexing social interaction that had made her feel personally erased. I would not go that far, but I cherished the rings, and they quickly became associated with the magical month that I spent in a town that I loved and that gave me a break from the morose realities of being ill. The rings even became associated with the fact that after my trip, I received the first encouraging CT and MRI scans in 3.5 years. My cancer had stabilized. Commenting on an episode where she loses and then finds the ring, Ruti says, quote, "It is clear that for me, these rings carry a poignant aura of the thing. And the fact is that I do not care that I know full well that their appeal is entirely phantasmatic." So we have first the question of how Lacan's sublimation, raising the object to the dignity of the thing, is brought into service for coping with grief. In Ruti's case, the contingent grief of cancer, which we can extend perhaps to climate grief, but also inquire just where that thing is, if it is in fact external to the subject or perhaps internal. For the ring as a signifier is, like the apple, an overdetermined trope. But also, Ruti's utterance that she knows full well the ring's appeal is entirely phantasmatic carries a suggestion of Manoni's je sais bien même, or the formulation of fetishist disavowal that is a hallmark of the pervert subject's Verleugnung. But Ruti, as I said, discusses the ring as thing in both texts. She gives a different origin story in Brokenness, telling us that, quote, "In the context of spending 6 weeks in Vienna, I found 3 relatively cheap silver rings in a store that have sold trinkets. They immediately caught my eye. I felt summoned by them. I bought 2 of them right away and came back for the third a few days later because I could not get it out of my mind. The point of the story is that I know on a deep level that these are the only rings I will ever want for the rest of my life. I may wear others that I already own, and I'm not going to reject a ring that someone might give me as a present. But I know with absolute certainty that I myself will not buy any new rings because these 3 fully satisfy my desire." 2 origin stories, both having to do not only with rings as sublimated objects, but also a kind of knowledge, an absolute certainty. And Ruti goes on to declare in Brokenness that the ring's status as objects of her desire, as things that allow her to articulate her idiosyncratic desire, allowed her to escape the clutches of consumerism and capitalism. So this is another role of sublimation, alongside that of coping with grief, be it benchmark or ontological. And it also helps us to distinguish, and this is really the inside baseball moment of this talk, the Lacanian rabbit hole. Here I've put on my glasses. I have all kinds of scrawls on my sheet here. So we need to distinguish the thing from das Ding, but also from the object petit a. The object petit, so here I'm thinking alongside Rick Boothby as well as Todd McGowan, how they've thought about these things. But the object petit a was developed by Lacan shortly after the nonce concept of das Ding. Das Ding is never talked about after Seminar 7, except for once, I think, and refers not so much to a thing that we have sublimated, but in the object petit a, but instead to the very succession of things that Ruti says her rings protected her from. I hope I'm not exceeding the bounds of hospitality to refer to our host, Calum Neill's recent handbook, Jacques Lacan, The Basics, for a refresher on this distinction. Desire, Neill points out, is rarely for one object or achievement. Quote, "Very few people who write a book or a song or paint only write one book or song or paint one picture." And this works well with Lacan's example in Seminar 7 of Jacques Prévert, who has a whole series of matchboxes all linked together. It's not just one matchbox. You can't have a collection of just one. And of course, these examples, writing a book or a song or painting, work well because they have to do with creativity. The object petit a, Neill adds, then is not so much a placeholder for that succession of objects or achievements. Rather, the imperial objects are a substitute for the object petit a, which is, of course, not so much those things as that which causes us to want those things. It's structural. It's our ontological lack. And if on the one hand, we can see that Ruti's exploitation of sublimation and the thing offers a stark contrast from the object petit a. On the other, since we are back at ontological or constitutive lack, the idiosyncratic or benchmark traumas of cancer or climate grief don't compare. They don't stack up. They're not fungible. I want, too, to supplement my essentially literary critical reading of Ruti's texts with Anna Kornbluh's bracing critique of auto theory, part of a larger argument with respect to how the circulation of meaning matches a deprofessionalization and precaritization of the academy. This is Kornbluh from her forthcoming book, Immediacy, coming out from Verso next year. Kornbluh writes, auto theory's flexible modalities and limitless mobilities disperse it widely. In these lucrative and revered works, academics proffer lyrical expressions of personal experience and impressionistic musings punctuated by theory quips, often shaped as aphorisms, fragments, elliptical non-narratives, and momentary illuminations. These texts rebuff systematic elucidation. Fullnesses of charismatic persona, corporeal receptivity, and affective flooding devise an evanescent plenum that preempts criticism. The trademark theoretical posture of unassailability for the auto-theorist relies on her own vulnerability to insulate herself from scrutiny. Immediacy in theory is just argumentless intensity, immured from dissent and devoid of higher order integration. Now, while this full-throated critique is in some ways accurate with respect to many of the texts Kornbluh discusses, Maggie Nelson, Sarah Ahmed, and so on, Ruti's is also rife with that systematic elucidation. And yet, it also features, by dint of its origins in Ruti's own cancer diagnoses, something similar to the theoretical posture of unassailability. Indeed, is uncomfortably proximate to the lean-in feminist vulnerability that such self-help authors as Brene Brown have monetized. And of course, Ruti is very good on talking about self-help as well. So maybe it's the contagion from that narrative. I think it is also possible or necessary to view Ruti's turn to auto theory as itself a sublimation, an act of raising the object of her grief to the dignity of the thing that is the text. Okay, so in order to work out these questions of creativity and sublimation with respect to climate grief, I want now to turn to two Cli-Fi novels, The Sunlight Pilgrims and The Box. Jenny Fagan's The Sunlight Pilgrims immediately poses a classificatory dilemma if we read it as a creative response to the trauma of climate change, however, for two reasons. First of all, set in the winter of 2020, although published in 2016, it raises the false impression that it will deal with the COVID-19 pandemic, summer of 2020 or fall of 2020. Second, it concerns not global warming, but a sudden deep freeze. In the penultimate chapter, we are told the temperature is minus 56 Celsius. Quote, the landscape is brilliantly lit, flawless. The mountains look like somebody has cut them out of the sky. The skies are clear and blue, but the wind still bites and nips at any exposed inch of skin. Each of them wears snow goggles so their eyelashes don't get frosty, and balaclavas pulled up right over their face and nose. The cold is clangorous. It vibrates, shrill and deadly. Mandy Susan Wong's The Box, published earlier this year, also poses problems for the Cli-Fi category, not only in the same substantive way as The Sunlight Pilgrim. It also concerns a brutal and unending winter, in this case laying waste to a city, but also for how, again in both novels, we have creativity as a response to grief by way of refusing or foreclosing the very object of that grief. Here's what I mean. In The Sunlight Pilgrims, the very question of what I earlier called the clusterfuck, or in more genteel academic language, the polycrisis, climate change, anti-Black racism, the pandemic, the rise of populism, wars in Ukraine and Palestine, Israel. The question of how what I earlier called this polycrisis is operationalized when a character is repeatedly queried as to whether they are more worried about the brutal winter or transphobia. And in The Box, climate denialism appears as generational violence. That is, it is displaced onto one's elders as a way to disavow one's own agency. Finally, these creative responses then are matched by the sublimation or elevating of an object to the dignity of the thing. In Jenny Fagan's The Sunlight Pilgrims, we are in a town in Scotland during an unprecedented, that's why I'm talking about it, I'm in Scotland right now, so I feel I have to write about a Scottish novel. We are in a town in Scotland during an unprecedented cold winter. Two of the central characters are Constance, who is hastily sketched as akin to a disaster prepper, and her child, Stella, who is transitioning. These two characterological types, or actants, show us how in the novel there is a duel, or a struggle for primacy between climate change and trans issues. First, in chapter 19, we see Stella's account of dealing with change room issues, restrooms, athletic change rooms, not having access to gender-free space, and their transphobic classmates. Quote, Stella can't even begin to explain how much she has dreaded gym class after that. It's worth going through an ice age just to not have to do that again. She could lie down in the snow like an angel and wait for winter to take her home. And then in chapter 23, in an email chat with Vito, an Italian trans friend, he asks, what's the weather like there? Are you scared it's an ice age? Stella finishes combing her hair while she thinks about it. She types a reply, more scared about how to go through transition. Don't know how to do it. I don't want any operations either, not even when I'm older. So for Stella, issues of transphobia and how to transition, access to puberty blockers and surgery are more urgent, less scary, worth going through than climate change. And here I'm arguing that in the novel, the extra cold winter stands as a dialectical inversion or negation of the actual existing conditions of global warming, the old name for climate change. The intergenerational conflict, here a matter of my interpretation, but in the novel writ large, between the survivalist mother and the trans child, is also operative in the box. When we learn that acts of violence in an unnamed city's unending winter have been carried out by a group of students in retribution to my generation, why not? I'll take the blame. My generation's malfeasance with respect to climate change. Quote, they ravished the earth, so it's gone cuckoo and forgotten how to administer climates and meteorological routines. Consequently, there's so much snow, we can't ride our electric scooters and shan't ever have cars. They've disconnected the electricity, so we can't plug in our phones and stream pornography and purchase useless paraphernalia over the internet. And now they're threatening electricity rationing because of the climate emergency. As students talking. The old woman heard them opine that everyone over 30 should be put out of the way unless they're providing for children. So we have then in the two novels creative responses to climate grief, to the climate crisis then, both the question of how to prioritize or swap out one grief or crisis for another, transphobia versus climate change, and then the disavowal of one's responsibility for anthropogenic climate change by way of intergenerational conflict. Both novels help us understand the question I left hanging in my discussion of Ruti and the thing versus the object pitié. That is, the question of whether creativity helps us to sublimate as a response to grief, the trauma, a raising of the object to the dignity of the thing, and then the problem of whether privileging trans issues over climate change or shifting blame for anthropogenic climate change constitute forms of climate denialism, which then turn out to be a fidelity to one's own idiosyncratic desire as rooted in ontological lack. To develop this argument, and by way of concluding this evening, I want to think about the coincidence of opposites of climate denialism and activist science. To do so via the tropes of Freud's ketalogic and Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grieving. In Joseph Dodd's 2011 book, Psychoanalysis and Ecology at the Edge of Chaos, Freud's theory of ketalogic is applied to various defenses mobilized against the anxiety of climate change. Quote, there's nothing wrong with the climate or kettle, or there was a hole in the planet when you gave it to me, or there's nothing we can do about it. A more extended homology can be found in Michael E. Mann's book from 2012, The Hockey Stick and the Climate Wars, where he declares that, quote, there is a hierarchy to the climate denialist canon that ranges from, quote, CO2 is not actually increasing to, even if there is warming, it's due to natural causes, all the way to whether or not the changes are going to be good for us. Humans are very adept at adapting to changes. Besides, it's too late to do anything about it. and/or a technological fix is bound to come along when we really need it. In both cases, from Dodds and from Mann, the logic is riven with contradictions that suggest what we might call a climate denialist unconscious. Climate scientists, however, hew strongly to the university discourse, rationalist, quantitative, shorn of jouissance or ideology. This is clear in Mann's discussion of the role that tree ring data plays in the 2009 ClimateGate scandal, where climate denialists seized on a 1999 email between scientists that referred to a, quote, trick used to swap out so-called proxy data, tree rings, coral, ice samples, and instrumental temperature records, among other charges, denied by the scientist, Michael Mann, in a Wall Street Journal op-ed, where he argued that, quote, men and women who have dedicated their lives to advancing science need not apologize for keeping their rigorous professional journals free of the pollution of what is purely politics. So scientists are afraid of politics, so they call it pollution. Further, we can see Mann's hierarchy of the denialist canon, which almost sounds like a fanfic utterance, something close, if not to Kubler-Ross, then to Zizek's appropriation in Living in the End Times, where the 5 stages of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance are, respectively, aligned with the analysis of ideological obfuscation, violent protests, political economy, subjective pathologies, and the emergence of the ethical revolutionary subject. This concatenation of Ketalogic and Kubler-Ross, Silver Ring and Dusting and the Thing, Cli-Fi and auto theory, then, allows for some preliminary conclusion on what Mari Ruti's theory teaches us about our attitudes towards climate change. I have 2 propositions. In an important paper on sublimation, Scott Critch shows how for Ruti, quote, when the world seems to fall apart, when we fall from fantasy, the experience of such trauma may entail for a subject new opportunities for creative expression. This is to see grief and the object providing us access to a new relation to our singularity. Remember, this is idiosyncratic or contingent. But then I also said I have some problems with the notion that ontological lack, that any card-carrying Lacanian sees as constitutive due to our being speaking subjects, can provide with the creative, innovative capacity to endure the kinds of more contingent lacks. As Ruti writes, quote, from a Lacanian viewpoint, it is only the fall of our most treasured fantasies, particularly of the idea there is some sovereign good that is capable of shielding us from the terror of living, that allows us to transition to a more imaginative and creatively engaged psychic economy. More specifically, she continues, the disbanding of fantasies enables us to better listen to the idiosyncratic particularity of our desire, and in so doing, begins to forge a singular identity apart from the social conventions that seek to determine the parameters of our being. A similar dynamic, this is me again, is at work in today's coincidentia oppositorum, where the treasured fantasies of the left have been stolen by the anti-vaxxer and populist right, with antecedents in the corporate wing of the climate denialist movement. See Naomi Klein from her new book, Doppelganger, quote, this pattern is rampant. On the one hand, appropriation and trivializations of precious language and symbols used to fight state terror and cover-ups. On the other hand, aggressive attacks of those very movements, including the pro-cop renaissance, the abortion bans, the wave of book banning, and other attempts to make knowing true history an illegal act. Naomi Klein's assemblage of rightist actions reminds us how, in today's political climate, various attempts are now being made to conceptualize the layering or stacking of climate change, the pandemic, populism, and state anti-Black violence, from the anodyne polycrisis to more activist intersectionality, and my own term, clusterfuck. Nevertheless, it is important to recognize that in this country, and I don't know if I'm in the UK or Scotland right now, but as well as mine, the opposition to trans rights or vaccine mandates overlaps not only with climate denialism, but is part of the 21st century growth in various forms of folk skepticism towards science, alongside the rise of conspiratorial thinking and populism from anti-vaxxers and climate denialism, Brexit, and the invasion of Ukraine to electoral malfeasance, paranormal discourses, and opposition to trans medical access. Along 3 vectors, an account of the polycrisis of events and conditions, the question of whether to see such skepticism or denialism as the effects of top-down institutional misinformation or inherent in liberal democratic politics, and a Lacanian theory of the subject and knowledge grounded in a passion for ignorance and the ethical act. I think I'll stop there. That's more than enough, and see what we want to talk about. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Clint. An enormous amount to think about there. That was a roller coaster and a exciting and educational roller coaster. I was thinking, listening to that, following your arguments, and just towards the end, it occurred to me that you had. I was thinking carefully or studiously avoided. I mean, that's me imposing an idea on you. Maybe you didn't intend to avoid it; you just avoided it. But you managed right up to the very end to avoid using the word truth. And a lot of what you're talking about seems in some ways to hang on some notion of truth, the perspective we take, how we situate ourselves in relation to particularly climate change. And one person's climate denier is is ignorant of a truth, and from the other perspective, it's the scientists who are confusing us or themselves being ignorant of truth. So there's a kind of curious positioning of truth there. But then right at the very end, just as I was having the thought, you used the words, I think you were quoting Naomi Klein when you used it, or you were at least referring to Klein and talking about true history. So I wanted to start with that. I mean, there's a big one to start with, but I think it's an important question to position ourselves in relation to, as I know neither you nor I are clinicians, but Lacan was, and Lacan's theory is initially worked out with that idea of the analysand in the clinic, and their truth has a very different sense, in the sense that the verifiable external truth is largely irrelevant to what goes on in the clinic. It's the subject's relationship to their truth that's important. But once we start to export Lacan to the world and use Lacan's theory to understand the world, then it seems truth necessarily takes on a different position or a different force. And I wonder how do we navigate this terrain while being true to our kind of Lacanian ideas, if we want to be true to our Lacanian ideas, but also true to our desire.
Great. Thanks, Calum. Or to be faithful to it, another problematic kind of metaphor. But I mean, three things I think of. First of all is the notion of post-truth. So the social conditions of what I elsewhere have called, postmodernism 2.0. Trump as like the return of Reagan, and that notion of this kind of the Teflon president, as Joan Kopchak used to talk about Reagan in her work in the 90s. Second is knowledge versus truth, the Lacanian distinction there. And the third is, and I'll just start with this one, Alenka Japancic in her essay on conspiracy theories in a collection that Adrian Johnson and maybe Zizek or someone else edited in the past couple of years. It might be in a University of Edinburgh collection. But she talks about how conspiracy theorists, of say the QAnon types, but also in the paranormal world and so on and so forth, they actually believe in truth, and they think they know the truth, and they think that there's somebody up there who knows the truth, and it might be someone they like Trump or Q, or it might be people they don't like those damn scientists. But what Japancic says is that they're not skeptical enough in a certain kind of way, right? And then in terms of knowledge versus truth, I mean, I think a lot of science is knowledge. It's the university discourse. And this is something that in with the way Lacan talks about the four discourses in Seminar 17, he wants us to be very skeptical of knowledge, and both because of our passion for ignorance, And Danny Novus talks about this, but also I know Cindy Zeiher has a book coming out on this as well. I think Danny's book is Knowing Nothing, Staying Stupid. And that knowledge is me before we started recording, and I'm blabbing on to you. Oh, I have all these ideas, blah blah blah, kind of thing. It's like it's going to blow out of my head or something. It's this pile of shit I'm giving you. Whereas truth, in terms of a truth in the analytic session, or the truth of one's desire, is a much more rare and fragile thing. And this is where, I think I do like to think of Lacan in terms of structuralism and post-structuralism and postmodernism, but it's where he does differ from some forms of that, and that he does believe that there is truth, in the same way Badiou does. So that was truth versus knowledge, the idea of post-truth and as postmodernism, and then the conspiracy theorists believe that there is a truth, and for the conspiracy theorists, it's the sheeple who don't know, right? So when the anti-vaxxers were out protesting and so on, they're like, "Don't you realize COVID's not real, or the vaccine is bad for you," and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Yeah, you kind of you kind of touching on Seminar 17 there. I mean, you talk quite a lot about Seminar 7, but shifting to Seminar 17, there's a fantastic quote from Lacan there. He talks about the curious copulation of science and capitalism. And I wonder, that seems to be quite salient to a lot of the discussion here. I think you're absolutely right that truth in a Lacanian sense is has a different force. This kind of truth in the sense that you're talking about it in relation to climate denialists, or the populist front, or it's a phantasmatic version of truth in inverted commas rather than a Lacanian truth. But I wonder, moving more into that idea of Lacan and discourse that I think your answer points towards there. There's a question here, and this is a question for me that predates my hearing your talk, so it's a little bit unfair to ask you, but your talk opens so many relevant things up that I feel you may be the person that can help me think this through. There's been a curious shift in the way we talk about environmental concerns. So you're using the term climate tonight, but the term climate, at least in my experience, maybe my poor memory, but the term climate seems to be a fairly recent deployment. We used to talk about environment, and before that we talked about pollution, and there seems to be this very significant and very much wholesale shift in the terminology we used. And as Lacanians, we can easily understand this as a shift in the master signifier, the master signifier that has conditioned or created the possibility of our understanding of what's going on in terms of weather patterns, the environment. I mean, it's difficult to talk about without already invoking one of the particular master signifiers, and that's kind of my point, that we can't talk about this without using the discourse that is available to talk about it, but the discourse that's available has shifted. My question, my unfair question to you is, can you help me to understand this?
Not at all, but I do think about this a lot. I mean, for instance, even like the difference between global warming and climate change. So, I mean, there's a new book by David, I think his name is David Lipsky, called The Parrot and the Igloo, which I really recommend. It's a very readable, hilarious book, but very gloomy at the same time, about the ways in which the climate denialist industry took a lot of its bag of tricks from big tobacco. So basically, the tobacco industry, beginning in the late 50s, early 60s, they created all this scientific, on the one hand, a scientific apparatus, and they both have a scientific apparatus, but they also were skeptical of what at that point it was medical science in terms of smoking being bad for you, and then it was atmospheric science in terms of climate change and so on. So anyway, it's a hilarious kind of book and very the parrot and the igloo. But so that argument is there, and he talks about the lobbyists sort of pushing for I think it's during the first Bush period. So what's that, late 80s, I guess, early 90s, of pushing towards changing the language from global warming to climate change itself as a way of softening the sort of impact and so on. So there's that kind of social action going on in terms around signifiers. But also my colleague in this group of analysts that I work with, the clinicians, Joe Scalia, talks very much about how all the hegemony of climate change as the only thing that matters now on the environmentalist kind of left means we're not paying attention to pollution, means we're not paying attention to habitat loss for animals, means we're not paying attention to things like plastics in the ocean and nanoplastics and all these other kinds. I mean, we are in some ways, but climate change has become, that's what COP is about, the Conference of Parties, which is meeting this year in Saudi Arabia, I think, or something. So that climate change itself has become the sort of dominant or hegemonic kind of master signifier. And we have to use it, but we also, I think we have to think about, how then it's subject to, point de capitant, to retroactivity, to attempts to sort of pin it down. It means this, no, it means this. And I confess that in the same way, I go back and forth between talking about grief versus trauma. Is trauma what causes grief? Is trauma our reaction to, is grief our reaction to trauma? And trauma itself has metastasized, of course, in the past couple of decades. But I don't want to give up on those signifiers, because I think they can be useful. And in the same way, grief itself can be useful for the very fungibility, for the very fact that grief can name something very, as Mari says, very personal, idiosyncratic, and contingent, and things that have a larger kind of benchmark or larger kind of, whether it's because they're felt by us more largely or because they're more social in the way that, say, the pandemic was a trauma that was, I mean, you don't get much bigger in terms of a global kind of sort of moment. And then how to compare those kind of those traumas or that kind of grief to each other. How do they swap out, or how do they stack, or how fungible are they?
But it also then becomes almost a more manageable fantasy, doesn't it? That this is, to me, this seems the danger that we slip into this idea that, if I put my wine bottles in the recycling bin, I've done my bit for climate change, and it's a nebulous enough term that's, it literally functions as a signifier. It has no signification. Yeah. So I can convince myself that, in the classic Lacanian fantasy, everything's going to be all right in the end if I just do a little bit domestic bit, which kind of ties into that idea that you're talking to in terms of the split between, or the risk of a split between the idiosyncratic and the social, that if the idiosyncratic becomes exclusively private, then, there is no hope for the social at all.
I just very quickly, I mean, I think that's partly my argument, which I need to develop more, is that we're all climate denialists. And this, in another version of this paper, I go through Freud's four Vers, Verberfung, Verleugnung, and so on, like disavowal, foreclosure, repression, negation. And when we by cycling to public transit instead of driving my oil spilling kind of car, then I'm like, I'm doing something for the environment. I know very well, in the same way Mari says she knows very well that those rings really aren't going to heal her. I know very well that it's not doing much, but and that's then we're in the same species as my brother-in-law who works in the oil industry, who loves his massive sort of Ford truck and that. So the denialists, the anti-vaxxers and so on, they're not just those people over there, like the Brexiters in your own kind of situation. They are also us. We've also all had times where do I have to wear a fucking mask again, right? And we've all felt that. Everyone has felt that. I mean, it's just that it's in the nature, and so we like to have this feeling that it's only others who are the kind of pathological subjects. But my interest in the subjectivity, then, in a certain kind of way, is in part because to use Todd's and so on's locution, it's a universal subjectivity.
Mm. But there's also that curious theft of enjoyment, isn't there? That either side can legitimately hate the other because they've stolen their enjoyment. The good environmentalist can enjoy their goodness, and and from the other side, the climate denier can enjoy driving their dirty car and polluting the environment. So there's that kind of social antagonism that arises from this as well, which maintains the whole process.
Yeah, and that kind of the enjoying driving the car, that jouissance. That's something that Miguel Rivera talks about in his essay in our Lacan and the Environment collection. And I mean, I think that's again something that's uncomfortable for some on the eco kind of left to sort of grapple with. Is there or our enjoyment about being this kind of beautiful, or is it enjoyment about being a beautiful soul, right? The Hegelian idea that I'm not the bad person, that I'm somehow removed from the fray. Pardon me?
The moral high ground.
Yeah, for sure. And also this relates then to the role that the thing or das thing plays in terms of navigating us in terms of our desire or our jouissance, which is the real, again, in North America, the term, I don't know what the UK version or the British or Scottish version would be, but we call it inside baseball when you get too deep into the rabbit hole of the theory itself. But thinking about das thing versus the thing and the object petit a, and whether, if you're raising the object to the dignity of the thing, is i.e. when she buys the rings, is that the same thing as das thing, which is more of a sublime object, is something that's scary in a certain kind of way, and what is their respective relations? And something that Richard Boothby is such an amazing sort of explicator on. Well, he's not he hasn't explained it for me, but I love reading him talking about it. Is that what are the thing or das thing's relation to jouissance and to desire, and how do desire and jouissance sort of differ in a certain kind of way? Because if we are encountering, and this is why I think in some ways the climate denialist is an ethical subject, because they are not giving ground to their desire. And we want to think, oh no, those knuckle dragging Brexiters, or those knuckle dragging anti-vaxxers, there's knuckle drag. It's a class thing as well, even though it doesn't. It's a fantasy of class difference. We want to think they somehow are not as ethical as we are. But I think if you follow the Lacanian argument about ethics, it can't just be about people you agree with. It has to be a position that might work for people who have politics we don't agree with, but still they are remaining true to their desire.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree, and I like the way you read Mari on sublimation as well, because it's a slight bugbear of mine. That's I think a lot of people read Freudian sublimation into Lacan, and I think Lacan, particularly in Seminar 7, is unraveling a very different understanding of sublimation, which I think Mari touches on very well, and you explicate very well. So it's refreshing to hear. I'm aware that I'm hogging you with questions, and there are other people here. So please, if you're in the audience, if you have a question to ask, then please do just stick your hand up, and we can unmute you, and you can ask a question. While we wait for questions to come from the audience.
Well, actually, I have
one. Garrett, please.
Good.
If you can unmute.
Got it. Okay. Thanks very much, Clint and Calum. Really enjoyed listening to the presentation. And while you said you're not a clinician, I find a lot of what you've said quite directive. Actually, it's helped me think through. I see a lot of people with what would be essentially a master signifier climate anxiety, and thinking through these what you've spoken about. If you don't mind me asking you a question, if I see the therapeutic approach of therapists working in this space at the moment, I'd probably break down the approaches in different variations in maybe 4 ways. The one would be a more ego psychology approach, which is how to cope with climate anxiety. The second would be a process of grieving and coming to terms with the grief. The third would be maybe more of a critical approach, where there's supporting radical action, and you can think of the therapist working with Extinction Rebellion and stuff like that. And then maybe the fourth approach would be this tendency towards, and I think that this currents through all of them, recollective exercise, our connection with the more than human world. I'm a pre-candidate to the LSP, and kind of, thinking about alienation, the speaking being that separated this inevitable loss. And I'm wondering about this current that seems so important for eco-psychologists and other therapists about the recollective exercise. And I wonder, just when you speak about this polycrisis, it reminds me of different encounters with the real. And if you don't have any thoughts on just what is being offered, or this kind of recollective elements, and is there a part of is there something that can be recollected in the real, like what you're saying is Mari Ruti kind of differentiates her perspective of the real slightly as not this wholly traumatic thing that Zizek identifies it as. And thanks so much. I've got your book as well. It's really beautiful. Appreciate it.
Oh, thanks. Thanks very much, Garrett. That's a really amazing question, and I'm sure I'll be inadequate in answering it. But I think so you're saying recollective in the sense of memory, I guess?
Yeah, memory, yeah. And just the relationship to nature. So if I think about the kind of rise of Shinrin-yoku and or forest bathing, and
yeah. I mean, a couple, three things in terms of that. Again, in just to plug the Lacan and the environment again, in the introduction, Paul and I talk about, do we think about nature or the planet or whatever as our child or as our mother? And that notion of protecting, that we have to protect our child. But then it gave birth to us, and these are tropes, right? That are commonly found, or signifiers that gave birth to us. But we also, as we know, as Freudians or Lacanians, we have this terrific ambivalence in both cases. A child is being beaten, or do we want to fuck our mother? Do we want to kill our mother? And that's when we think about whenever some eco activist says the earth is your mother, I'm like, yeah, my mother died 30 years ago. She abandoned me. She's already dead, or you're dead to me, whatever. There's a real between two deaths thing happening, I think, in terms of the planet in general. I mean, for most of us on the planetary sort of situation, nature is a lost cause. We're living in these, either even in bourgeois urban environments, or total sort of slum planet sort of hellholes. And what is nature as some kind of a site we can sort of go to? And I live on the West Coast, and I go hiking every weekend. I totally fall for that. But the other side, in terms of forest bathing in particular, Hilda Fernandez Alvarez has an amazing essay in our collection about forest suicide, which is the forest of suicides in Japan. And so, I mean, again, we have this thing of the forest is a place where you can go and get fresh air, and you could be in the moss and all these kind of things, And again, I totally fall into that sort of Canadian kind of banal sort of thing. But also, the forest is a site of death, and nature is a disaster, and nature is about death all the time. So I think in some ways, our relation to nature needs to be more understood as being more complex than simply either something that we should take care of or that will take care of us. I mean, in some ways, nature is indifferent to us, or it's hostile to us. George Carlin, the American comedian back in the 70s, said, save the planet. The planet's not going anywhere. What people really mean is protect the biosphere so that complex fauna and flora can survive. And I agree with that. But save the planet, obviously, that's a different kind of demand as well.
Thanks, Garrett. Fantastic question, and thank you, Clint. Do we have any other questions from the audience? But
there was something. Sorry, Calum. Somebody in the chat sent me a link to an article at newarab.com, which talks about the current siege of Gaza as creating an environmental crisis. And I know there is a new book coming out next year from Pluto on environmental warfare in Gaza, and there's even been sort of like a Zionist calls for creating Gaza a nature reserve in a certain way. So like this sort of settler colonial idea of the national park will take the place of actually existing people. And that's certainly a thing in North America. Anyone who knows North American history is aware that nature becomes this sort of place where we clear out the indigenous people, and then we just have nature itself, as though nature doesn't evolve people. So again, it can be this fantasy object. It can be this screen in all of Freud's sort of complex meanings of a screen that both hides things and something we project onto for some very some very kind of dark fantasies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have differences notwithstanding, a similar thing here as well in Scotland. That we have these. You've been to Scotland, at the the beautiful Highlands, which is it's a fantasy nature. It's not a real nature, and people used to live there before they sent them to Canada.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, or you go in the Highlands and all of a sudden you're there where some battle took place 500 years ago, and isn't that nice? There's a battle here, and they killed each other, but now we can go for a hike.
Yeah. Another question with the audience. I wanted to bring in another signifier that's struck me as curiously absent from your talk. You mentioned left and right a couple of times, so it's kind of bubbling there under your discourse. But I wonder where you situate the economy in all this. That we're talking about the climate, and you use this from I like your term clusterfuck, but also the idea of the polycrisis seems a really useful one. But surely one of the key elements of the polycrisis is the economic crisis, and I wonder how, again, climate concern functions as both a fantasy that safeguards us from consideration that, in the sense there's something tangible, and as we're just saying, the tangible fantasy is a large part of the climate. You can go into the forest, you can go into the mountains, you can see it, you can touch it. It's real, even while it's a fantasy, and much easier to relate to than something as, albeit very much impacting on us in a quotidian fashion, something much more complex to understand. I'm not suggesting biomes and what we might broadly categorize as nature and the natural environment isn't complex, but we can relate to it in a very simplistic level, whereas the economy hits us in a very real level without us being able to necessarily understand the machinations of the economy. And do you see the economy as being part of this discourse, or do you see the economy as something quite distinct from this discourse?
Okay, I was thinking about three things in terms of this. One is the different ways that Ruti, but also Todd McGowan, when he writes about dusting in that book on reading Seminar 7 or whatever it is, the way in which edited by Carol Owens, the way in which they talk about sublimation in relation to capitalism. And I mean, Ruti's argument, and I just love I mean, I really mourn the fact that she can't tell me why, but I love the fact that in these two essays that I'm drawing on, that'll be available very shortly, in the next 6 months, that she has these two different origin stories for the thing about buying the rings, but that she talks about that sublimation as actually a kind of a prophylactic or a protection against capitalist sort of consumerism. That this object becoming a thing sort of means that she doesn't have to fall into some kind of mad list sort of consumerism. And uh, and this feeds well, I think, with your explanation of the object petit A, that it's not just one. The object petit A is not just one thing, or that we don't just want one thing, and that that those things themselves stand in structurally for the object petit A. But also, Todd McGowan in his essay differentiates. On the one hand, he says that capitalism does a kind of sublimation when it raises an object to the dignity of the thing, except that actually existing sublimation can also be a way that protects us from that sort of machination. So it's an interesting contradiction in what Todd is doing. And then Rick Boothby in his in Embracing the Void, a very important kind of book. He talks about money as dusting, and that money is both a precious thing, but it's also, again, it's fecal. It's like shit. We talk about dirty lucre, and indeed, there's a whole thing about how dirty the actual pound notes or dollar bills become, because they go through people's money, they go through people's hands, and so on. But then it's specifically around the question relating the financial crisis to crises, to the climate crises, or to poly crisis. On the one hand, there is this desire to be more specific in terms of talking about climate change, and there's the term Anthropocene, which generally designates the notion of anthropogenic climate change, that it's readable in the geologic record and so on, stuff that all of us just take on faith because we don't really know how to do that kind of science, but we're told. But I actually prefer the word Anthropocene to, like, Donna Haraway and other critics have proposed, there's Plantationocene, there's Capitalocene, there's Chassulocene, there's Settler Colonialocene. All this, and this is the classic sort of neurotic subject, right? That's not it. That's not it. They have to keep sort of cycling through these kind of signifiers. But also, I think in some ways, calling it the Capitalocene, that just saying that that it's unevenly distributed, it's the northern, it's the north, it's the west that has caused more of the climate crisis than the global south, and so on, is another form of climate denialism. Because, I mean, yes, to be sure, wealthy nations, Europe, North America, have had added an enormous load on in terms of the carbon pollution in particular. Nonetheless, to insist on that is another kind of disavowal that's going on there, I think, arguably.
Yeah. And confounds the whole argument as well. because I think there's a complexity there it's all very well for the developed countries to suddenly turn around and tell people, no, you shouldn't develop because that's bad for the environment. Whereas, we're quite happy to have reached the stage we've reached. So it becomes quite a challenge. We had a question in the chat there, which is, I think, a very, very good question to end on, which is, how does individual responsibility sit within this? And I think you did very much touch on this within your talk, and I think it sits within that that argument around sublimation. But I don't want to answer for you. I'm gonna,
thanks.
Pass it to you.
Zoyima, I think it is, who asked that question. That's a really good one, and I think this comes back to ideas of singularity, or the particular, the singular subject, and then questions of totality or universality. So Mari Ruti was very much interested in theorizing singularity, and argued that sublimation has to do with realizing the singularity of one's desire. So it's not that one shouldn't recycle or buy carbon offsets or what those kind of pathetic Western bourgeois sort of disavowals and so on. But one should act in accordance to one's desire. And in terms of what one's desire is in terms of climate change itself, and how individual responsibility relates. And then it's in question, I guess it's the question of universality versus totality or totalizing. Alberto Toscano has differentiated universality from totality, and totality is certain again more on the Marxist side with thinkers like Frederick Jameson. And I think that helps me think about this as well as a dialectical relation between the singular individual remaining true to desire, and then notions of social responsibility or social justice, and which again has a cleavage, to use Lee Edelman's kind of terminology, that there are contradictions at the level of the social as well. The universal is not some monolith, is not some pure seamless kind of whole, but rather it's always fractured.
And
hope that helped.
Always in the future as well, no? To use that kind of Fanonian idea of the universal, that the universal is what we strive for rather than what we satisfy ourselves with.
It's to come, yeah, the future to come.
Brilliant. We've hit 9:30, which is our kind of our stopping time. I think that's been an incredibly rich, fantastic talk, but also a really rich conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone else has as well. It's been brilliant. So thank you very much, Clint. We will be back on Lacan in Scotland on the last Thursday of November, and we hopefully will have Anna Madil from Leeds talking to us then. So please do join us then. Thank you all for joining us this evening, but thank you especially, Clint, for making this evening possible.
Well, thanks, Calum, and thanks everyone for joining in as well. I really appreciated having the opportunity.